And one of the things you guys emailed me after last week's webinar is several of you said that you could come up with a plot outline in terms of broad strokes events, but you had a great deal of trouble turning events into scenes. And I can understand that because a scene has a lot of parts. Scenes have structure, scenes have functions, and events don't. Events are just like this happened, this happened, this happened. But if you write the story like that, it's really boring because scenes use a lot of different techniques to dramatize those events. So the first step in turning an event into a scene is to start thinking in terms of action. Don't ask yourself what happens. Ask yourself, what are the characters going to do as a result of these events that I've set in motion and the situations that it puts the characters in? So don't look at like, oh no, there's a revolution and the rebels are being spied on. Don't think of that as the event. That is the context in which the characters start acting. What are these characters going to do when they realize they're being spied on? What are these characters going to do when they realize that the mole is one of them? What are they going to do when they realize that they're being spied on, and if they go and take care of the heroine, they're more likely to get caught than they were before? So you always want to think in terms of character action. And when you're planning scenes, there are a lot of different definitions of scenes and a lot of ways to look at scenes, but I would like to suggest that you start with this one. A scene shows things changing for your characters as a result of conflict. If nothing changes in a scene, you have a boring scene that doesn't move the story forward because that change is the story moving forward. So it's one thing to say, okay, here's an event and it has a lot of conflict in it, but don't just look at the conflict. Also look at how the conflict changes things. Ask yourself, what is the main conflict I want to show in the scene? And then where does that conflict start creating change? And where does it stop creating change? And newsflash, the start and stop of the change is actually a good place to consider starting and stopping the scene. So I would also encourage you when you're looking at these events to always ask yourself, how am I going to show these events? I don't want to tell the reader that these events happened. I want to show them happening. So looking at these 6 storylines, for Elise's stepfather beating her, I want to show the beating. I want to show Elise being upset about it. I want her to protest, and I want her to feel the threats. So I want to show the stepfather threatening her too. Because she's seeing her mother be beaten, and it's going to trigger her helplessness, and it's going to motivate her to try and bargain with Jonathan, I want to make sure that somewhere in that scene, I want to see her thinking about how this is never going to get better unless she does something. I want to feel her hopelessness. I don't want to be told that she's hopeless. I want to actually show her experiencing hopelessness, what that feels like for her from her point of view. And of course, the hero's internal arc, the hero is not in this first scene. He's going to be affected by it later. So that's probably going to have to be a different scene. We're probably going to have the scene of the beating, and then we're probably going to have a scene where Jonathan meets Elise and sees the evidence of the beating, and that's going to trigger his wound. So, and then looking at the romance can't start till they get together. So this change that we say is going to happen as a result of the beating is going to be something that will have to happen in a scene where Jonathan and Elise are together. For the inciting incident of the hero's external arc, we don't just want to see them planning. We want to see them doing something toward their goals. So what could they be doing? I don't want to show them being talking heads sitting around drawing X's on a piece of paper or like pointing to things on a map. You can kind of get away with that in a movie because there's so much visual detail being shown to you. But when you're reading it, that's really boring. So I thought, what if they're spying on the armory? What if they're like sitting there on the top of a roof, shivering because it's cold, and they're kind of hungry and their feet are falling asleep? They've been there for hours and they're like taking notes and doing the incredibly boring legwork of trying to figure out where the weak point is in the patrols, while at the same time having a conversation that lets the reader know in an emotionally charged way that they're in trouble, that they're having a hard time with getting to the British, that maybe the British are spying on them, or they're worried about that. Basically something that gives an emotional context for what's happening and also shows the characters at the very least struggling with discomfort and possibly struggling with their feelings about each other. And so then the inciting incident of Abraham being forced to spy, I'm not sure I would actually show that to the reader. I think that won't be a scene, that'll be backstory. Because if I show the reader right up front that Abraham's wife is being kidnapped by the British and he's being, blackmailed into spying for them, that is going to let the reader know right up front that what's happening, so it won't be a surprise when Jonathan finds out that Abraham is the traitor. So here is one of the scenes that would fall out of that. I would have Elise wake up, hear her mother crying out. She runs to help thinking her mother has fallen and hurt herself, and she walks in and Rutherford is beating her mother, and Elise is going to be shocked. And he's probably going to leave now that she shows up, but he's going to imply that she's next if she interferes. And of course, if I were Elise and my mother had just been beaten by my stepfather for some inexplicable reason, the first thing I would do is comfort my mother. At some point while I was taking care of my mother, I would probably think about how I needed to do something to get her away from Rutherford. And this is the scene that motivates her to contact Jonathan. So I want to make sure that somewhere in this scene, she's racking her brains for like, how can we get away from Rutherford? What can we do to... we don't have any power. He controls all our money. We would have to steal one of his horses. How am I going to get away? And she's going to think, oh yeah, my best friend, my best friend's husband's best friend. He's kind of like an action-y kind of guy. He could probably help me get out of here. And I think she is probably not going to know for sure that Jonathan is one of the revolutionaries, but she's going to probably suspect because she knows Abraham's wife, and I think Abraham's wife is going to be pretty anti-British. And Abraham is also going to be pretty openly anti-British. So she's going to guess that he's someone who might be willing to help her. There's another scene that's going to fall out of this, and I would have it be separate. I wouldn't have it be the same scene. Elise is going to have to arrange to meet Jonathan, right? This is going to be a setup for that event. So how is she going to do that? She just can't show up at his house. He's known to have anti-British sympathies, and Rutherford is the British. I think we decided he was the captain of the local forces, so she can't be seen with him. So she's going to stop by her best friend's house. Maria isn't home, but her husband Abraham, the traitor, says, oh, Maria's visiting family, but tell you what, why do you need to see her? And when Elise says, oh, I really needed to see your friend Jonathan, but I didn't want my stepfather to know, Abraham's going to agree to set the meeting up, even though Elise is not going to be willing to tell him what it's about. And I would not actually write this whole scene if I was going to write a novella, because I would be trying to keep it short. So I would just somewhere in a future scene when Jonathan meets Elise, I would have a very short paragraph of summary that just made it clear that Abraham made the arrangements. And that's going to be important for the plot later, because remember, Abraham is spying for Rutherford, and he's going to know Rutherford's going to want to know what Elise is up to. So that's going to be important for the plot later, but it doesn't have to be a whole scene. It could be a paragraph. It could be a throwaway comment that Jonathan makes to Elise in that one scene later where he says, well, so Abraham tells me you absolutely insisted. Like, why did you go to the trouble of setting up this meeting through my best friend? And that would be enough to let the reader know later when they realize that Abraham's a traitor, that that's how Rutherford found out about what Elise was up to. Okay, so another scene falls out of those inciting incidents that we talked about, because Jonathan and Elise actually have to meet. She's going to have to make the offer, I will steal information for you if you'll help smuggle my mother and I out of the colonies to some place that Rutherford can't find us. And Jonathan's going to refuse, because remember, he's got that trauma. It's way too dangerous. He might allude to that woman he used to love, or he might not. He might just think of her. And if we're writing in his point of view, we can have a little flashback to his memory if we want. Or if it's in her point of view, maybe he's actually going to tell her, no, I've already lost one woman that way. I'm not doing this again. And then when Elise makes it clear that she knows that he's a revolutionary, he's gonna say, "Holy cow, keep your mouth shut. If your stepfather finds out for sure that I'm the one leading the rebel unit, we'll be in trouble. So I want you to lay low. Trust me, I know I can kick the British out. I've got something cooking. Please just go home." So that's another scene that falls out of those first inciting set of incidents. Another scene, remember, we have to set up the hero's external arc, so we can have a scene where Jonathan and Abraham are hiding on the rooftop. And I picked Abraham rather than another rebel because I want to set up their friendship and I want to set up that betrayal. So they're going to be sitting there. It's really uncomfortable. They're hiding. It's boring. It doesn't look like there are any weaknesses in the defense, so they're kind of upset about it. Jonathan's going to probably notice that Abraham is distracted, and he's just going to say, "Oh, I'm tired." So this is the beginning of Jonathan noticing that things are not right with Abraham, but it's going to be a small thing. It's going to be the kind of thing he can brush aside and then realize later, whoops, I shouldn't have ignored that. And during that conversation, since they are very focused on beating the British, I'm thinking that Jonathan might be reminded of that woman that he left and lost, just because that's the motivation that drives him. Another scene we could write, we could actually not just have the flashback be a quick mention, we could have it be a whole scene. And again, if I was trying to make this a novella and keep it to 30,000 words, I wouldn't. I would just have it be a brief memory in another scene. But if we were writing a novel, we would have time to do a flashback. We would actually get to see Jonathan discovering his fiancée, and we would get to see her dying in his arms, and we would get to see how it wounded him so deeply that he is now a tortured hero that is just never going to be able to love again. So we have multiple scenes that have fallen out of this. And so once you have figured out what the different scenes are that could happen, that's when you start looking at a timeline and you start asking yourself, what should happen first? How do I want to open this novel? It's a romance, so I'm going to open it with Elise. Where do I want to introduce Jonathan? I decided that I want to introduce him before he meets Elise. I want to establish that friendship with Abraham. I want to show his character so that we see him in action. We see him as a revolutionary. We get to hear why he feels the British should be driven out. So that when Elise meets him, the reader already has a feel for what kind of guy he is. I will show her arranging to meet with him because it's a plot point. And I will do it after we've met Jonathan, just for the sake of I want to have introduced Abraham also before Elise meets him to kind of show what kind of guy he is and set it up that there's not a reason. It's a little bit of a misdirection by making him seem to be a really good guy in scene 2. When Elise meets him, she's going to trust him, and the reader won't have a reason to think he's the traitor. So the reader is going to trust him too and feel like Elise is doing the right thing and is not going to automatically think, ooh, she shouldn't have told that stranger that because he's going to be going and reporting to her stepfather. The flashback, I would probably put it in before Jonathan meets Elise. I'm not a big fan of flashbacks personally, but if it fits for the novel, if it fits for the story, I would just try and keep it short and vivid and just stick it in there right before Jonathan and Elise meet. So you can see I came up with these scenes in a different order than I put them in the timeline. And no matter how well you think you've set everything up as you do each storyline, it's always a good idea to consider, do these belong in a different order than I came up with them in? Because they often will. And the farther you get into the story, the more divergence you get. At least that's been my experience. So looking always at dramatic impact, we're going to open with Elise, a woman in danger, 2 women in danger, really. So that immediately tells the reader, sets the conflict high and the stakes high, women getting beaten. Then we can go to a lower stakes scene where maybe not as much is happening. The reader doesn't know that Elise and her mother are going to be okay. For all we know, Rutherford's going to come back in an hour and beat them again. So switching to a lower key scene, after having set up that really intense conflict, the reader's going to have a little bit of suspense because the question in their minds is going to be like, but what about Elise? Is she still okay? So that will help add to the anxiety and help keep tension going for scene 2, which is going to raise questions in terms of like, how is the rebellion going? Is Jonathan the kind of guy who could actually get Elise out? Is he the kind of person who could be trusted? So then we have like scenes 2 and 3 are kind of lower tension. They're still moving the story forward in terms of plot. They're developing character. But our next big tense high conflict scene that's going to have like a lot of strong emotion associated with it isn't until scene 4 with a flashback. And then that flashback, hopefully, if we see how horrified Jonathan was when his fiance died, when Elise comes to meet him, the residue of that terrible dream or that terrible flashback is going to color his interactions with Elise. And that's why I put the flashback first instead of putting it after he meets Elise, because I want that wound to be really fresh and raw when he has a conversation with this woman who's trying to get him in trouble.